Listen up.
I can imagine, Evelyn, it's not a surprise to you, based on our conversation earlier in the show, that she has now appeared because you said she wants to talk.
She wants to talk. I mean, she really is somebody who believes in the oath that she took to the Constitution. You know, that means she's a representative not of a particular president, but of the United States, the President of the United States, our government, our people. This is a very serious person.
Jeff Bennett, I think, is still with us. Jeff, I don't know if you're still plugged in. I know you were trying to get the ambassador to answer some questions for you. She has now entered the building. The last time, how long do we expect this to go? I know that the deposition last week that we saw with the former diplomat was hours and hours and hours, right? Is there any expectation that we have here?
This is an all-day affair here, Hallie.
Okay.
And here's the thing that people should know about Marie Yovanovitch. And you might have already said this, so forgive me, I wasn't listening to all of the programming. But this is a woman who has spent 30 years at the State Department cultivating her career. We don't yet know whether or not she is testifying, appearing here with the approval of the State Department. If she is not, that would suggest to me that she is risking a lot. Not just her government pension and all of that, if she, would have to leave her post or, faces any sort of repercussions for testifying here today. But she is not like Gordon Sondland, who, remember, had no diplomatic experience and got that post as the ambassador to the EU largely because he donated $1 million to Donald Trump's inauguration through a number of LLCs that he set up. So when Gordon Sondland, tries to run afoul of the State Department and says he's going to testify next week, despite the vow from the White House not to cooperate with this inquiry, that is a very different position that he's in than the one that Yovanovitch is in as a career diplomat. So we do expect the relevant, House leadership. Adam Schiff is there, obviously. We've got Republicans leadership positions on these committees. We do expect them to come and talk to us reporters at various points throughout the day, as they've done with different depositions. But I think it's important that people know that her appearance here today is certainly a decision she does not make lightly. And if she's doing it without the express support of the State Department, she is certainly risking a lot.
Hans, you are at the White House, and I know that you had been talking to officials who are waiting to see exactly what we had just been waiting to see, which was the arrival or not of the ambassador. We now know she's obviously in the building.
She arrived. We don't know if she'll talk, and I think that holds true for the White House as well. In some ways, they are flying just as blind as we are here, where they're trying to figure out whether or not their entire strategy, which is to prevent State Department officials from talking without an attorney present, if that will hold today. And it's important if it holds today because it's a test case for all the other, not just state, think of defense, think of all the subpoenas and depositions
Department of
that are out
Energy
there.
people, for example, with that new subpoena issued. Yeah.
This is the test case. This is patient zero, so we will see whether or not she actually speaks. She's arrived, she's appearing. Whether or not she speaks without an attorney present is the crucial question. And I suspect, yes, it's going to be an all-day affair, but I suspect we'll have an answer to that pretty quickly, Hallie, because if she declines to talk, that will start leaking out pretty quickly. Republicans may be quick to claim that this means the president's strategy is holding. So we could know within your hour whether or not she is sitting for a long deposition or whether or not she is staying mum. Hallie?
And just to be clear, these are staffers who will be conducting the deposition, but lawmakers are able to be in there, be in the room. We saw, for example, Mark Meadows walk in. We know as our camera in the hallway, the camera moves around a little bit there, that Devin Nunes is in Washington, or at least at a studio, although we don't know if he's on the Hill, as we take a look now at the door entryway there to see who else may be going in and out of that room. Matt, your thoughts here?
It is really hard to overstate how dangerous it is for the White House to be saying that these people shouldn't testify without a lawyer present. Normally when you ask for a lawyer to be present, that's to protect you, the witness. This is to protect them. And there is no precedent in our history for this. Congress has the absolute right to conduct this inquiry. They absolutely have the right to subpoena these witnesses. They have been told by the White House that they're simply not going to cooperate, and they have been given no legal reason for that. The White House sometimes uses this executive privilege claim, but there's no claim of executive privilege with the ambassador. She didn't have conversations about this with the president. This is just a pure power play by the White House to try to get their people to stay silent. I'm also kind of skeptical about the thing around Gordon Sondland, because the reporting this morning was that Trump allies want him to testify. They may be playing a game now where they say they don't want him to testify because he is clearly, a Trump guy. He gave a lot of money and he's politically connected.
You are taking a look on the left side of your screen of what we like to call the live shot tour of the Capitol Hill campus with our various cameras that are flooding the Capitol here, kind of giving you a sense of what we may see, who we may see. We're keeping an eye on that. Jeff Bennett, I think you're probably trying to run into the building now. If you can bear with me and talk with me while you are on the move here. Feel free to tell me you got to go if you got to go, my friend. But talk a little bit about
Well, you know what, Hallie, now that she's in the room, I'm all yours.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I hope you're not busy for the next 40 minutes. When you look at what she may say, let's keep coming back to the idea of why she is so important to lawmakers here. There have been allegations by, for example, now former Congressman Pete Sessions, who is, we believe, the congressman mentioned in the indictment of those two Giuliani associates we've been talking about, where he claims that she had been making, or heard she had been making, disparaging remarks about the president, about the administration. Ostensibly, that was part of the reasoning of why she was yanked out of Ukraine. What more can you tell us about that?
Right. And the dots that Yovanovitch can connect have to do with the how and the why, right? How Rudy Giuliani was running the traps there in Eastern Europe outside the normal diplomatic channels, and precisely why he was doing it. I mean, those were the questions that she raised. That is precisely why Rudy Giuliani sought to smear her. And that's not just a sort of editorializing. That's actually backed up by documentation in the whistleblower complaint in part, but also in the packet of disinformation that Giuliani sent to the State Department that the State Department IG then turned over to House investigators, Hallie. So that really is what these committee staffers are going to press her about.
Okay, so listen, we've got you, Jeff, we've got Hans at the White House, we've got our team of reporters and analysts covering this thing. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch is inside the room. We don't know yet if she is going to be answering questions from those staffers in that private deposition. I expect that our reporting team will have more information on that as the morning develops and as this hour develops, so we're going to stay on that. But we have to share with you some different breaking news now. It is a major ruling in a case involving President Trump's financial records, and it appears to be a win for House Democrats. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams, I think, is ready to go for us now. Pete, if you are, can you talk to me about what we're hearing about this ruling?
Well, I have the ruling here. I'm reading it now. This is a 2-1 ruling by a 3-judge panel of the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals in favor of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. This is the Elijah Cummings Committee. This is the committee that in April sent a subpoena to the accounting firm of Donald Trump asking for some financial records. And this followed Michael Cohen's testimony that said the president would inflate his net worth when he was trying to get favorable consideration for building projects and would underestimate it when he was trying to make insurance claims or other financial transactions, and that he wasn't fully reporting all the payments that he made involving the hush money payments. So the House committee subpoenaed records from Donald Trump's accounting firm. And the firm said, well, I'm sorry, we can't do that. And this went to court. The House committee won in the trial court, and then the Trump's lawyers appealed it to the D.C. Court of Appeals, which today ruled again in the committee's favors. Now, the argument against releasing these records by President Trump's lawyers was that the only time that Congress has the right of access to these documents is for legislative purposes, and this sort of a hunt that the committee was on, Trump's lawyers said didn't satisfy that criteria, but today in this 2-1 ruling, the court says yes, it does. So this, obviously the Trump lawyers can try to appeal to the Supreme Court. They can try to get an injunction to, or a stay on the judge's order to try to stop this. But for now, it's another victory for the House Democrats in this continuing series of lawsuits that are now working their way through the courts, both on access to testimony from Trump administration officials and access to financial documents related to the president.
Pete, forgive me if this is an obvious question, but is the Supreme Court, you mentioned it there, is that where this would go next? Is that the next step if the president's attorneys choose to escalate this?
They have a choice here. If they choose to appeal, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't, they can either go to the full Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals. The way it works in federal court is when you appeal, it always goes to a 3-judge panel, not the entire appeals court. But that is one option, is to go to the full panel, and then the other option is to go to the Supreme Court, and lawyers often decide, where are their best options, where are they more likely to prevail. The Trump administration has had some success in getting stays on lower court orders from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't usually like to do that, but they've had some success, and I would predict that's probably what they'll try.
NBC's Pete Williams. Pete, thank you very much for bringing us that breaking news. I appreciate it. As soon as we hit a commercial break, I will text the president's attorneys and see how they plan to respond. I know our team's working on that. I appreciate it. To also check in on a response, I want to bring in now the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. Senator Menendez, thank you for being on the show, particularly on such a busy morning.
Good to be with you.
Listen, we want to talk to you about Syria. That is why we asked you to come on the program, and we will. But I have to start with a series of developments that we have heard this morning. And let me start with what we just heard from Pete Williams, what appears to be a win for Democrats in getting the president's financial records. Are you confident the Democrats will prevail if this were to go to the Supreme Court?
They should. At the end of the day, this is a fundamental test of our Constitution. It's clear in my mind, also as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, that access to these documents is totally a legitimate request of the Congress, and so they should prevail at the end of the day. The president is not above the law, including getting access in this regard to his tax returns.
We, about 10 minutes ago on this show, watched live as Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, as you know, appeared on Capitol Hill for a closed-door deposition with House Democratic staffers, House investigative staffers on both sides, actually. You and your Democratic colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you want to hear from the ambassador as well. Tell me why. What are you hoping to learn from her?
Well, first of all, Marie Yovanovitch is one of the most highly respected ambassadors we have in the career foreign service. I sat as the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in some of her hearings when she was nominated to different posts. She is extraordinary. And I'm not surprised. I don't know whether the State Department tried to impede her or not, but I'm not surprised that regardless of what may have happened behind the scenes, that she is there testifying. That's the nature and the character of who she is. She's an example of our entire career foreign service, which Secretary Pompeo should be defending. What we want to hear from her is, first of all, why was she ousted well before her time was due? What was the request? I understand that she insisted that Mr. Giuliani make any request of the Ukrainian government to come to the embassy, not to be a lone ranger outside of the department's parameters and the ambassador in charge, which was her at the time. I'd like to know what took place not only in that regard, but her conversations at the State Department. This is why all of the Senate Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee have sent a letter to Chairman Risch asking him for hearings that includes her testimony.
Have you heard back? Do you expect that will happen, Senator?
Well, for both the chairman as well as Republicans in the House and the Senate, this is a moment in which they must decide to be patriots and not partisans. The president is the greatest threat to the Constitution of the United States since it was written. Madison, Washington, Franklin have to be turning over in their graves. And if our institutions are to stand the test, that means that people, regardless of their party affiliation, have to put country first above their partisan needs. So this is, I hope the chairman will answer the call. I don't know how all of these issues dealing with foreign policy, from Syria to what happened in Ukraine to Rudy Giuliani acting as a private citizen but seeing like he was the de facto ambassador. What did the State Department know? What did Secretary Pompeo know? I mean, these all affect foreign policy questions beyond the intricacies of any inquiry the House is having on impeachment.
You mentioned Syria, and I want to get to that, but quickly, based on what you have seen and the evidence already in front of you, would you vote to impeach the president if those articles came to the Senate floor?
Well, Holly, let me just say that if the House of Representatives ultimately votes and passes articles of impeachment, then the Senate will act as a jury. And as such, it will hear all the testimony to back up those articles of impeachment. So I'm not going to prejudge what the ultimate decision will be, but I am going to give it the very serious, deliberative process that is necessary, because this is a moment of constitutional crisis, I believe, that the president has taken us to. And so I'll reserve my judgment until that time.
Okay, Senator, I think you know that as part of my day job, I cover the White House for NBC News. I was on the South Lawn with President Trump yesterday when he laid out several options, as he called them, for how to respond to this Turkish military operation that is now in day 3 in Syria. The president talked about maybe sending troops to Turkey, maybe mediating a deal between the Turks and the Kurds, possibly tough sanctions. Let me start there. All these 3 options the president is speculating about, are any of them realistic? Would you support any of them? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we largely had an agreement. That's what this buffer zone was all about. And it was working well. All of our military tell us it was working well. The president is committed, in my view, one of the most significant national security blunders in what he's done here. At the end of the day, the Kurds were in the midst of fighting alongside with us, and more importantly, many times ahead of us on a counter-ISIS efforts. They have detained and are overseeing over 10,000 ISIS fighters that are in jails. They are now withdrawing from that because they have to defend themselves because President Trump allowed them to be attacked. The only people winning in this regard are Putin, Erdogan, and we also create an enormous challenge to Israel because Iran wants a land bridge that ultimately can attack Israel, and the Syria part of this that we were in creates an opening for them to do exactly that. So this is not to mention that globally we are sending a message: don't fight with and alongside the United States, because when they're finished with you, they'll let you die on the battlefield.
Quickly then, one of the things the president mentioned was sanctions. As you know, some of your colleagues in the Senate, Senator Graham, Senator Van Hollen, are introducing a sanctions package against Turkey. Does that go far enough?
Look, I'm always willing to consider sanctions, but what the president needs to do is change course. He needs to reverse. He needs to stop the security blunder that has so many dimensions. There are already, according to the Defense Department's Inspector General analysis, up to 14,000 to 18,000 ISIS fighters, apart from the 10,000 that have been jailed. Unleash the 10,000, and you have ISIS recreated, an enormous challenge to our interests. And I'd rather fight them there than fight them here on American soil.
Senator Bob Menendez. Senator, I appreciate you being back on the show. Thank you for joining us, especially on such a very busy news morning. Thanks.
Thank you.
We have more to come, believe it or not, because the president is signaling now, just this hour, some optimism for these trade talks with China going down in Washington. And you know what? The markets are reacting at.
Now that guy made a lot of sense. I don't know who he was, but he had a head full of sense. Sorry about me sneezing and coughing a while ago. Out here in the farm community, you get a lot of allergies and asthmas. Plus, I just got through unloading a bunch of wheat straw. Ain't no telling what was in that stuff. You got to have a good immune system to live out in the country, pertaining to dust and pollen. And if you don't, you probably hadn't got no reason to live out in the country because of that very thing. But you only have to deal with it at certain times of the year. And other than that, it's a whole lot better than dealing with smog and pollution, concrete, cars and people. So sometimes you gotta take a little bit of the bad that outweighs the good. Trying to figure out here what I want to do, if I want to end this right now or if I want to go on with it. Let's see what the commentators got to say before I decide to dismiss this particular video.
Staffers, including, of course, one of the guys we've been talking about, Ambassador Gordon Sondland. It also, look at the start of the week though. If you look at Monday, former NSC official Fiona Hill. She is the president's former top aide to Ukraine, to Russia, and this is going to be critical. Why? Because Hill, according to sources, apparently is ready to give an eye-opening account of how the White House has tried to pursue a shadow foreign policy on Ukraine. A former White House senior official tells NBC Hill's appearance is already making the West Wing anxious, while Congress waits to see if the administration will let her testify at all or if they'll try to invoke executive privilege. You see the byline on that story? NBC's Josh Letterman. I want to bring him in now, along with NBC's Ken Delaney. And Ken, my apologies to you for cutting you off earlier in the show. Ambassador Yovanovitch had arrived on the Hill, so we wanted to get to that. Josh, let me start with you here. Talk a little bit about what Fiona Hill plans on telling Congress and why this is so significant.
It is significant, Hallie, and a source that's close to Fiona Hill and knowledgeable about her testimony tells NBC News that she plans to testify before the House that Ambassador Sondland and Rudy Giuliani basically pulled an end run around the White House, around her and other senior officials like former National Security Advisor John Bolton, to run their own shadow foreign policy on Ukraine. That there's a typical custom way that people are supposed to interact with the president as far as foreign policy, and they basically circumvented that and were running their own show. This is significant for several reasons, and we expect that Fiona Hill, when she testifies next week, we know that officials in the White House and those close to Trump are pretty upset, pretty concerned about what she has to say, not only because she's not someone that was viewed as a Trump loyalist, she's someone that had worked in government before, has broader loyalties than just to the president, but also because she really had a front row seat for the entirety of the Trump administration to everything they were doing, not only in Ukraine, but also on Russia.
She is somebody who has been integral in some of those discussions. So what's the likelihood, Josh, that the White House might try to stop her from speaking here?
Well, the source that's close to Fiona Hill says that they expect that the White House will probably try to block her from testifying. It's a little unclear whether that will be successful because she's a former official. She doesn't work for the government anymore.
Right.
So they can try to assert executive privilege, but she's a private citizen. She has First Amendment rights. And the law is pretty murky as far as whether a privilege can be asserted over former officials. And it's possible that she may end up testifying under subpoena from Congress, which would give her a little bit more cover to basically ignore an instruction from the White House not to testify.
Ken, give us the broader 30,000-foot view here, because I think for a lot of folks, when we pull up the calendar of who's testifying, who's getting deposed, it's a lot of names, it's a lot of diplomats, it's a lot of information.
Right.
The key thing seems to be these are people who have insight potentially on what Rudy Giuliani was doing when he was trying to dig up dirt, and who told him to do that. Is that fair?
Yeah, and Hallie, I think it's pretty clear who told him to do it. The President of the United States. I mean, we know from the call with the Ukrainian president that Donald Trump was not hiding his ambitions with regard to Ukraine. He wanted them to investigate his political opponents. And that's what's at the heart of all this. That's why these witnesses like Fiona Hill are so important, because when they talk about this shadow foreign policy, the question becomes, to what end? What was the purpose of this shadow foreign policy? And we already know from these text messages that we've seen from Sondland and others that the purpose was to pressure Ukraine to investigate the Bidens and to investigate other aspects of the 2016 election that Donald Trump was interested in. And that was, in fact, a condition of good relations with Donald Trump. And to do that, they bypassed the normal diplomatic processes, the normal experts, and the White House should be terrified of the testimony of Fiona Hill, because she not only knows about this Ukraine stuff, she knows a lot of things about conversations with Putin, about what Trump told the Russians in the Oval Office. She's a native of England, a joint UK-US citizen, fluent in Russian, who became a Russia hawk over the years and has been working behind the scenes to sort of steer the Trump administration to get tough on Russia, even as Donald Trump has been soft on Putin. And she's been negotiating that behind the scenes. But look, big picture, Hallie, Rudy Giuliani and these characters, Parnas and Fruman, who've been indicted, they were all doing this in the service of Donald Trump's ambition to get dirt on his opponents from a foreign government.
Ken Delaney, I appreciate that. Josh Letterman, excellent exclusive reporting, great scoop. You can check it out on NBCnews.com.
Which had previously been banned on national security grounds from doing that business. Potential purchases by China of more U.S. agriculture.
Prize, it has been awarded this morning to the Ethiopian. If you thought the 2020 presidential race wasn't getting personal enough, you must have missed the president's rally overnight, where President Trump took it there against Joe Biden and his family.
Joe's son, Hunter, got thrown out of the Navy, and then he became a genius on Wall Street in about 2 days. Hunter, you're a loser. And your father was never considered smart. He was only a good vice president because he understood how to kiss Barack Obama's ass.
President Trump not just getting personal, but continuing to spread exaggerated, misleading claims. NBC's Mike Memoli has new reporting on the Biden campaign. Peter Alexander is over at the White House. Mike, tell us what you're hearing from your sources inside Biden world.
Well, Hallie, what I'm hearing from the Biden campaign this morning is that, listen, what they saw in terms of this split screen last night, this contrast between the president, in their view, increasingly unnerved and even unhinged as he's feeling the weight of the pressure of this investigation on Capitol Hill, and even now legal troubles closing in on his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, versus the statesman-like way that you see the former vice president talking about the issues that matter to voters. And this is a point Biden himself made explicitly in a tweet directed at the president. He said while he was at this HRC forum in Los Angeles yesterday talking about the fundamental dignity that all Americans deserve, the president is as he put it, showing little respect he has for anyone else. America is so much stronger than your weakness, as he put it. Now, Hallie, it's also interesting. We talked the other day about that speech the vice president gave in New Hampshire, much more direct, taking on the president on these issues. We also know that we tend to get even more insight into his thinking behind closed doors at these fundraisers. As a credit to the Biden campaign, we do have access to them. And so we know from a print pooler who was there when he spoke to donors last night, really even using more pointed language than Biden has in the past, calling Rudy Giuliani, for instance, a thug, saying that that in terms of the president, that he is his policy on immigration in particular is soulless. And he concluded with these remarks at this fundraiser last night. He said, "The president is the most dishonorable president in American history, and he picked the wrong guy to pick a fight with, because I'll tell you what, I'm going to beat him like a drum." That's the new line we've been hearing a lot from the former vice president these days.
He also said the president is as close to soulless as you can get, right, in that fundraiser?
That's right. He was talking about his immigration policy specifically there.
Peter, you had the opportunity to watch every minute of that Donald Trump rally overnight, as I know you were getting ready for the Today Show this morning. And it was notable in that this was the president's first one since the impeachment inquiry. He was, as we saw, extremely fired up. And by the way,
it says Boeing failed to overload. Boeing used veteran test pilots to determine how they would respond in an emergency. But the NTSB wants everyday airline pilots from all over the world in simulator testing. Boeing is now reviewing that process.
We want the pilots to make sure that they're focusing on those things that will keep the airplane safe and not those things that will distract you and kill you.
You do anticipate making changes at the FAA certification process?
I think that's likely, but...
Think so?
room and how long it'll last. We'll be right... are saying. NBC News investigative reporter Dan DeLuce joins me now. Dan, you have new reporting on a career diplomat resigning from the State Department. Was this a resignation and protest? What's the deal?
Well, that's the big question, and that's the implication. Michael McKinley is a very experienced career diplomat, and he was a senior advisor to Secretary of State Pompeo. And part of his job was sort of to take the temperature of the building, of the rank and file. And morale is very low right now. Really because of this Ukraine impeachment scandal. So the fact that he's resigning right now has got to be worrisome for Pompeo and for the administration.
And do we know when this resignation is effective, Dan?
Supposedly it's today. That's what officials are saying, and he's going to be issuing an announcement. But you know, whenever you lose a career diplomat like that at a moment of crisis, that's a problem, and there's been an exodus of career experienced diplomats out of the State Department.
And all of it against the backdrop, as you point out, of this standoff, if you will, between Congress, between the Trump administration, including these diplomats, one of whom arrived today over on Capitol Hill. Dan DeLuce, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for bringing that reporting to us. And thanks to all of you for watching this hour of MSNBC Live. Boy, TGIF has never had such meeting. Unfortunately, Ayman Mohyeldin still has to work it out in New York, and you have a lot on your plate, my friend.
I don't even know, to be honest with you, I don't even know where we're beginning the show, where we planned earlier in the morning and where we are now. So we're just going to roll with it. Hallie Jackson, thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ayman Mohyeldin in for Craig Melvin here at MSNBC headquarters in New York. The key players to watch in the Ukraine impeachment investigation. Right now, one is behind closed doors on Capitol Hill. A second says that he is ready to do the same, despite the White House's efforts to try and block both of them. We have a great group of experts and reporters to lay out
going to show up this morning. Members in both parties
subpoena from Congress. Why?
Dispute or a question about what is meant by notwithstanding. And here it is. It says, notwithstanding the State Department's current direction to not testify, Ambassador Sondland will honor the committee's subpoena. We read that as that was Sondland defying the White House, going ahead and strongly signaling that he would testify regardless of what the White House said. I talked to at least one White House official who said, well, I wouldn't read notwithstanding that way. I think notwithstanding is still holding out the possibility that Sondland will actually honor the objections from the White House. So there's confusion. It is clear, though, amidst all this confusion, the White House's strategy of preventing officials from talking to Congress may be falling apart, and that has implications not just for the State Department, for the Energy Department, the Department of Defense, OMB. If individual officials feel that they have to comply with these subpoenas and disregard that White House 9-page letter that laid out basically the no cooperation at any cost, then that means we're at a different phase of this inquiry, one that has potentially troubling implications for the White House. Ayman?
So, Hans, one other thing for you. President Trump held one of his longest campaign rallies last night in Minneapolis, pretty much by some accounts exactly where he wanted to be, going off the rails in some sense, going after everyone. How did he address the impeachment pressure that he is up against?
Look, he criticized, he questioned the authenticity, the legitimacy of the probe. Listen to how the president put it and tell me if you think this is a president that feels like he needs to cooperate with a co-equal branch of government.
When all of their ludicrous hoaxes have been exposed as frauds, these sinister fakers then try to impeach you for daring to call out their own corruption. We just got rid of the Russia hoax, and then a week later the Ukraine hoax starts. I had a week of I can think about everything perfect, it's so beautiful.
So that was about 14 hours ago, guys. I suspect we should all be refreshing the president's Twitter feed to see what he's saying about his donor, Ambassador Gordon Sondland, as well as the former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and her appearance in front of the testimony. Until we hear from the president, a lot of what White House officials are telling us isn't necessarily meaningless, but they might not have the best sense of the strategy because the strategy is clearly rests with the President of the United States.
Garrett, for the most part, the White House has been stonewalling the Democrats' request in this ongoing probe. How are the Democrats, expected to escalate the impeachment fight in the days ahead?
Well, just to build on something Hans talked about, confusion here. Confusion may be part of the White House strategy to keep everyone guessing about who will show up, and quibbling about the definitions of words like notwithstanding means we're not talking about the bigger picture issues here. That's what Democrats want to continue to focus on. They want to continue to focus on what the president said and did, both in the notes from that call with Ukraine and frankly publicly in the White House driveway talking about China. Democrats will probably continue to roll out subpoenas, as we have seen over this last week, day after day, subpoenas with rolling deadlines into next week. Now remember, Congress has been out for the last 2 weeks. They come back next week. All the members will be here as these subpoena deadlines hit. And if you're looking at that calendar, I think that some of these to watch are some of the outside players. Now for the two former colleagues of Rudy Giuliani's, if they're still guests of the federal government, I think it's probably fair to say they won't be showing up to testify, but documents could be asked to be turned over. And also the document requests that go to outside agencies, the DOD, the Department of Energy. it's clear, or at least it appears the case as of this morning, that the administration has less control of the outside agencies than they do over the folks who work in their building. We're seeing it with the State Department. Will we see a similar degree of independence from the Department of Defense, for example, a traditionally more independent agency? We could find out as early as next week.
All right, our thanks to Hans Nichols and Garrett Haake for all of that as it unfolds on Capitol Hill at the White House. Joining me now is Abigail Tracy, a staff writer for Vanity Fair and NBC News correspondent Carol Lee. Abigail, let me begin with you because you wrote in a piece for Vanity Fair about Marie Yovanovitch, and essentially you say that her quick exit didn't sit right. After all, a veteran diplomat with decades of experience is exactly who the State Department would traditionally want to interface with a fledgling foreign government amid transition. Help me get our viewers up to speed on this. What is the backstory as to why she was fired, and why would investigators in this impeachment probe want to talk to her?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you saw was sort of a series of events that really began when the ambassador gave a speech sort of calling to crack down on corruption in Ukraine. And she essentially called for the ouster of one of Poroshenko's anti-corruption, funnily enough, officials, really just calling for him to be fired. And that was really when the trouble for Yovanovitch really started. And what you saw after that was kind of this, smear campaign, so to say, of, where you had individuals like Rudy Giuliani or some individuals who were on other networks that were kind of spinning this web of conspiracy that had this State Department official kind of in the center of it, and really saying that she was fighting against the Trump administration or talking negatively about them. And then what you saw is the State Department recalled her 3 months early from her post, ahead of schedule. And at the time, the word coming out of Foggy Bottom was this was as planned. But it really doesn't make sense to, recall a veteran diplomat who has decades of experience in Ukraine during a presidential transition in a country, that does have a history with corruption and does have a history with these problems. So what you saw is a reaction on Capitol Hill and among other diplomats, sort of confusion, so to say. To get political.
Tax, and why another?
Not a crime. I don't know what the hell is. When you need answers first thing in the morning.
What do you make of the movement of these conversations into the more secure server?
You need to go deep inside Washington.
Do you believe that is an impeachable offense?
And hear from someone who's been there.
Get the facts, analyze the facts, and make a decision based upon the facts.
You need your Morning Joe, weekdays at 6, only on MSNBC.
Tonight, President Trump is hopping from the Midwest to the South for another rally, this time in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And last night, in his first rally since the impeachment inquiry began, the president lashed out at his current favorite, as you can imagine, the Biden family.
Joe's son, Hunter, got thrown out of the Navy, and then he became a genius on Wall Street in about 2 days. By the way, whatever happened to Hunter? Where the hell is he? Let's do another T-shirt. Where's Hunter? Where is he? And your father was never considered smart. He was never considered a good senator. He was only a good vice president because he understood how to kiss Barack Obama's ass.
All right, joining me now is Ashley Parker, White House reporter for The Washington Post. She is also an MSNBC political analyst, and Joel Payne, a Democratic strategist and the former director of paid media for Hillary for America. Joel, let me begin with you, because the president really yesterday took aim at Joe Biden, really in a very nasty way, going after him, as we just heard in that sound, but also going after Hunter Biden.
Given what we saw in the indictment, there are also questions about a Russian national who's mentioned in that indictment who allegedly funneled $1 million to the two men who then donated it to state political candidates for some influence. So there's a lot swirling here, Linda. It pertains both on the criminal level, that's going to be prosecuted in Manhattan in the Southern District of New York, but then you've got the whole way that they relate potentially to the Ukraine impeachment inquiry, and then you add Rudy Giuliani into it. And interestingly, Rudy Giuliani says he admits that he was having lunch with these two men at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., just hours before they made their way to Dulles Airport, about 40 minutes outside of Washington, attempted to board that flight for Frankfurt, Germany, before they were stopped by the FBI, taken off, and then arrested. So a lot happening. Linda?
Yeah, a lot for you to stay across, certainly. So these men obviously arrested when they had this one-way ticket out of the country. Fascinating.
Yes.
Jessica Schneider, good to have you with us. Thank you. Well, could there soon be a breakthrough on Brexit? The EU's chief negotiator.
The plot thickens. Good luck to all of us. Shalom.